As the first shovel of cold clay hit my son's coffin, I heard my daughter whisper to her husband that the lake house needed to go on the market by spring. She said the assisted living place on Route 9 had a waiting list, and if we didn't act fast, I'd end up costing them a fortune in unnecessary care. I didn't argue. I didn't even turn my head. I just kept playing the part of the broken old fool they already thought I was. But that night, I climbed out through my own garage window and got into my brother-in-law's truck. He drove me 40 minutes out to an old boatyard on the edge of the county and told me not to breathe a word of it to my daughter. When he pulled back the tarp covering what was underneath, I nearly fell to my knees. Before I tell you what I found in that boatyard, let me know where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had family look at you and see nothing but a burden, hit that like button right now. My name is Walter Higgins. I'm 71 years old, and I buried my only son 3 days ago. Marcus was 44. A heart attack took him in his sleep, quiet and cruel, the kind of death that doesn't give you any warning and doesn't give you any mercy either. His wife Denise stood on one side of me at the funeral, and their son, my grandson Tyler, stood on the other. Both of them dressed like they'd stepped out of a magazine, both of them dry-eyed in a way that made my stomach turn. I had raised Marcus alone after his mother passed when he was 9. I worked 2 jobs, sold insurance during the day, and drove a delivery route at night, just so he'd never have to feel what I felt growing up poor in that town. And now I was standing over his grave, an old man with nothing left in the world except a house that wasn't mine anymore in any way that mattered. Denise leaned close to Tyler while the pastor was still speaking. I heard every word because grief hadn't taken my hearing, only my will to fight. She said the market was hot right now, and the lake house, the one Marcus and I had built together with our own hands, over 15 summers, needed to be listed before interest rates climbed again. Tyler nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed somewhere past the casket. Neither one of them looked at me. I stood there in my one good suit, the same one I'd worn to my son's wedding, and I felt something in my chest go cold and still, like a lake freezing over in November. When the service ended, Tyler finally turned to me. He put his hand on my shoulder the way you'd pat a stranger's dog, careful and distant. "Grandpa," he said, "we need to talk about arrangements." Not for the funeral, he meant. For me. He said the lake house was too much house for one old man to manage alone, that the stairs were a liability, that Meadowbrook Senior Living had a lovely studio apartment opening up next month. He said all this standing 6 feet from his father's open grave, and I understood in that moment that my grandson had already made his decision, and my grief was simply an inconvenience standing between him and the paperwork. I let my shoulders drop. I let my eyes go glassy and far away. I mumbled something about missing Marcus, about not understanding why God takes the good ones first. I let them believe that grief had cracked something loose in my mind because I needed time, and the only way to buy time was to become invisible to them. We drove back to the lake house in silence, the 3 of us in Tyler's German sedan, and I watched the pine trees blur past the window and thought about how quickly a family can turn into a real estate transaction. The house was quiet that evening, just a handful of neighbors and Marcus's old fishing buddies stopping by with casseroles nobody would eat. I sat in my recliner by the fireplace, the one Marcus bought me for my 65th birthday, and I watched Denise move through the house like she was already cataloging it for an estate sale. She slipped into the study, the one room in that house that had always been off limits, the one room where Marcus kept his father's old rifle collection and the fireproof box that held our family papers. I watched through the doorway as she opened the gun cabinet and ran her fingers along the stocks of 3 rifles that had belonged to my own father, weapons older than the state of Michigan itself. She pulled out her phone and started taking photographs, the kind of photographs you take for an online auction listing. I looked over at Tyler, standing by the mantel with a beer in his hand, watching his mother appraise his dead father's inheritance like it was inventory in a warehouse. He didn't say a word. He just checked his phone and took another sip. Something old and bitter rose up in my throat, 30 years of memory compressed into a single, unbearable moment. I remembered driving Marcus to his college interviews in a truck with no working heater because every spare dollar went into his tuition fund. I remembered working Christmas Eve shifts so he could have new sneakers for the school year. I had broken my back so that boy would never know what it felt like to go without. And here was his widow cataloging his father's rifles for sale before the dirt had even settled on his grave. I pushed myself up out of the recliner and walked slowly into the study. My steps were heavy and deliberate, but I kept my face slack, kept my eyes unfocused. Denise froze with a rifle halfway lifted from its rack. "Please," I said, my voice trembling just enough to sound frail. Those were Marcus's grandfather's guns. Aid wanted Tyler to have them someday, when he was ready. Denise didn't even flinch. She set the rifle back with the careless motion of someone handling scrap metal. "Walter," she said, her voice syrup-sweet and hollow, "we both know you can't keep firearms in a senior facility. It's better if we handle this now, while everything's fresh, rather than dragging it out." I turned to Tyler, playing the part of a pleading old man, waiting for him to defend his grandfather's wishes. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Grandpa," he muttered, staring at the floor. "Mom's right. Let's not make this harder than it has to be." I turned and walked out of that study without another word. I shuffled down the hallway, my head bowed, giving them exactly the performance they wanted. But the moment my bedroom door clicked shut behind me, the trembling stopped. My spine straightened. My mind, which had felt fogged with grief for 3 straight days, snapped into a clarity so sharp it almost hurt. This wasn't grief anymore, driving their behavior. This was a coordinated liquidation, and I was the asset standing in their way. If I stayed in that house one more night, I understood with total certainty that I would wake up to moving boxes and a signature waiting for me on a piece of paper I wouldn't be allowed to read closely. I cracked my door and listened. Down the hall, I heard the specific sound of a real estate app pinging on a phone, and Denise's voice, low and businesslike, mentioning a number to Tyler. 620,000, she said. "Lake frontage like this doesn't sit on the market long." I eased the door shut. I pulled a canvas jacket from my closet, the one I wore fishing, and I did not pack a single bag. I unlatched my bedroom window, the one that led out onto the porch roof, and I climbed down into the cold October air, just like I used to sneak out as a teenager 60 years earlier. Except this time I wasn't chasing a girl. I was running from my own blood. My brother-in-law, Ray, was waiting 2 streets over in his old Ford, engine idling low in the dark. Ray had been married to my late wife's sister for 30 years, a quiet man who fixed boats for a living and rarely said more than he needed to. He didn't ask questions when I opened the passenger door and climbed in. He just looked at me, his face carved from granite, and said, "Rosalind knew this would happen." She told me. Walter. She knew. I stared at him, my pulse hammering. "What do you mean?" She knew. Rosalind, my late wife, dead now 11 years from cancer, hadn't spoken a word to Ray about our family in the last year of her life that I hadn't been present for. Or so I thought. Ray kept his eyes on the road, driving us away from the lake, away from the only home I'd known for 30 years, out toward the industrial edge of the county, where the old boatyards sat rotting along the river. "Keep this between us," Ray said. "Don't tell Denise. Don't tell Tyler. We've got work to do tonight." The silence in that truck stretched long and heavy, broken only by the hum of tires on cracked pavement. I had no phone. Denise had asked for it that afternoon, said she needed to back up my photos before I lost them, and like a fool playing his part, I'd handed it right over. I had no wallet. I had nothing but a canvas jacket and a brother-in-law I barely understood, driving me toward a stretch of riverfront I hadn't visited in 20 years. "Ray," I finally said, "what did Rosalind know? What has she been hiding from me?" Ray didn't answer right away. He reached over and cut the radio, gripped the wheel tighter, and when he finally spoke, his voice sounded like gravel dragged across concrete. "Your wife was smarter than every accountant I ever met, Walter. She saw what Marcus was becoming years before you did not. Marcus himself, God rest him, but the people circling him. She saw Denise's spending habits. She saw the way Tyler was raised to expect things instead of earn them. She knew that the day you were left alone, they'd move fast. And she made sure you wouldn't be defenseless when it happened." A cold knot twisted low in my gut. Rosalind and I had been married 38 years. She'd handled our finances down to the last nickel, kept a ledger of every dollar in a spiral notebook on the kitchen counter, and I trusted every page of it completely. The idea that she'd built something outside of that notebook, something she never once mentioned across 11 years of marriage before her death, I felt like the ground shifting under a house I thought had a solid foundation. We left the paved roads behind and rattled down a gravel track lined with rusted chain link and the skeletal remains of old warehouses that once serviced the shipping trade before the river traffic dried up decades ago. "Why are we out here, Ray?" I asked, staring at the crumbling brick buildings sliding past the windows. "There's nothing left out here." Ray took a hard left down a narrow lane, gravel popping under the tires. "You're wrong about that," he said quietly. "There's a whole lot out here. You just never knew where to look." He pulled up to a long metal boathouse at the very end of the lane, corrugated siding streaked with decades of rust, a padlock chain wrapped around two heavy sliding doors. He cut the engine, and the silence that followed felt enormous. He reached into his coat and pulled out a single iron key, old and heavy, and held it out to me in his open palm. "Take it, Doug." "I mean, Walter," he corrected himself, and something in the way his voice caught told me this moment meant more to him than he was letting on. "This is what Rosalind left you. But you have to hear me out first. Keep this quiet. Don't tell your daughter-in-law. Don't tell your grandson. Until you understand what's behind these doors, you're a ghost to them, nothing more." I took the key. It was cold and impossibly heavy in my palm, heavier than a piece of iron had any right to feel. I looked from the key to the massive dark shape of the boathouse looming against the night sky, and I thought about my wife, the woman who used to hum old hymns while she washed dishes, the woman who balanced our checkbook at the kitchen table every Sunday night with a cup of chamomile tea, and I realized with a jolt that I had never truly known the full measure of her. I stepped out of the truck. My boots crunched against loose gravel and broken glass. Ray came around and worked the padlock loose, and together we hauled the heavy sliding door open along its rusted track. It screamed in protest. Ray reached inside and flipped a breaker switch on the wall, and high above us, a row of industrial lights buzzed and flickered before flooding the cavernous space in blinding white light. My breath left my body entirely. I staggered back a step. I had expected filing cabinets, maybe an old safe. I was not prepared for 6 pristine wooden boats lined up in a row like sleeping animals, their hulls gleaming with fresh varnish, classic mahogany runabouts, and one breathtaking 1,958 Chris Craft with brass fittings polished to a mirror shine. Beyond the boats sat a workshop stacked with marine restoration equipment, and against the far wall, filing cabinet after filing cabinet, neatly labeled in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. Ray walked me through it slowly, his voice steady even as my legs felt like they might give out beneath me. Rosalind had started small, he explained. 30 years back, buying wrecked and abandoned wooden boats at county auctions for pennies on the dollar, paying Ray under the table to restore them on weekends while I worked my insurance route and my delivery shifts. She'd sell the restored boats to collectors 2 states over, quietly, always in cash or through private sales that never touched our joint accounts. But the boats were only the beginning. She'd taken those profits and funneled them into small parcels of undeveloped land along the river corridor, land nobody wanted back then, land that had since become some of the most valuable waterfront real estate in the entire county, now that the developers had discovered it. I asked Ray, my voice barely a whisper, why she never told me, why she let me believe we were just scraping by on an insurance salesman's commission. Ray's face carried a weight I'd never seen on him before. "She wanted to tell you every single day," he said. "But she watched Marcus grow up soft in some ways, spoiled by good intentions, and she worried what would happen if he knew too early that there was a fortune waiting behind door number 2. She wanted to see if he'd build his own character first. And when Marcus married Denise, Rosalind watched that woman's spending habits for exactly 4 months before she quietly decided nobody outside this boathouse would ever know what was inside it. I walked slowly past the Chris Craft, trailing my fingers along varnished mahogany, trying to absorb the scale of what my wife had built in absolute secrecy. Ray led me to a filing cabinet, pulled out a leather ledger, and set it in my hands. The pages were filled with Rosalind's careful handwriting, columns of numbers, parcel numbers, appraisal values. I flipped to the final summary page and stared at a number until my vision blurred. $14,200,000. Land, restored vessels, and a private brokerage account Ray had helped her manage discreetly for over 2 decades. A sealed envelope slid loose from the back pages and fluttered to the concrete floor. Ray bent down and handed it to me without a word. My name was written across the front in Rosalind's shaking, late-stage handwriting, the same handwriting from the final weeks before the cancer took her voice entirely. I broke the seal with trembling hands. The letter was short, because my wife never wasted a single word in her life. "Walter," it read, "if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and it means someone tried to push you aside. I built this so you'd never be at anyone's mercy." I watched Denise circle our family for years, waiting for her moment. If she or Tyler ever try to take what's yours, don't hold back. Burn it to the ground. All my love, always, Rosalind. I read those last 4 words over and over, burn it to the ground, until the paper shook in my calloused hands. The grief that had been crushing my chest since the moment I watched my son's casket lowered into frozen ground began to transform into something harder, something with edges. It didn't disappear. It sharpened into purpose. My own granddaughter-in-law was back at that lake house right now, photographing my father's rifles for an online sale, and she had absolutely no idea that Rosalind had spent 30 years quietly forging a weapon and placing it directly into my hands from beyond the grave. I folded the letter and slid it into my jacket pocket, right against my chest. I closed the ledger with a heavy thud that echoed through the boathouse. I turned to Ray, and for the first time since Marcus's funeral, my voice came out steady, cold, and absolutely certain. I asked him how we reached the person Rosalind had trusted to handle this if it ever came down to a fight. Ray gave a grim nod and walked to a metal desk in the corner, pulling out a plain black cell phone, preloaded with a single contact. The name on the screen read, Priscilla Vance, attorney at law. Ray told me she was the most ruthless estate litigator in the state, and that Rosalind had kept her on retainer for over 15 years without my knowledge. It was time, Ray said, to make the call. It was time to burn it to the ground. Ray drove me back to the lake house before sunrise, and I climbed back through my bedroom window just as the sky started turning gray at the edges. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long moment, folding the frail old man back over myself like a familiar coat, letting my shoulders slump, letting my hands find their tremble again. When Denise knocked on my door an hour later to ask if I wanted breakfast, I answered in a voice thick with confusion, and she smiled at me with the satisfied warmth of a woman who believed she had already won. Over the following 2 days, I watched them accelerate. Denise brought in a man she introduced as a wellness consultant, a nervous fellow in an ill-fitting suit who asked me what year it was and whether I could name the current president. I let my jaw go slack. I stared past his shoulder at the wall and mumbled an answer from a decade earlier. He scribbled notes furiously, clearly paid to reach a predetermined conclusion, and by the time he left, he'd signed a preliminary competency evaluation that Denise tucked into her purse like a winning lottery ticket. I sat in the kitchen afterward, staring at the counter, and let real tears fall, because grief for my son was still raw and true even while I fed it into their lie. That evening, Tyler sat across from me at the kitchen table with a single sheet of paper and a cheap pen. "Grandpa," he said gently, "this is just a form to help manage your accounts while things settle. Standard stuff." I let my hands shake as I gripped the pen. I did not need reading glasses to see clearly that the paper was not an account management form. It was a limited power of attorney, broad enough to authorize the sale of real property. I signed it anyway, my signature jagged and unsteady, exactly as a confused old man's would look, because Priscilla Vance had already told me through Ray the night before that the more rope they took, the harder they would eventually hang themselves. By Thursday, Denise had a cash buyer lined up for the lake house, a developer named Frank Delgado, who specialized in tearing down waterfront properties to build luxury condominiums. I overheard her on the phone in the kitchen, her voice pitched low with excitement, quoting a number, $610,000 cash, closing within the week, using the power of attorney to bypass any messy family disputes about the sale of a dead man's home. She hung up glowing, and I sat in my recliner with my eyes fixed blankly on a rerun playing on the television, giving away nothing. That night, Ray tapped on my window in the dark, and I let him in through the same route I'd used before. He told me he'd installed a small camera inside the smoke detector in the living room 2 nights earlier, while everyone slept, feeding directly to a laptop Priscilla was monitoring downtown. He told me Denise had already forged a second document, backdating my signature on an earlier version of the power of attorney to make it appear I'd granted her authority weeks before Marcus even died, a detail that would matter greatly once the fraud case was built. I told Ray to let it play out. If we stopped them now, it was just an ugly family argument. I needed Denise to actually accept Frank Delgado's cash. I needed the wire transfer receipts. I needed documented felony fraud, not a family disagreement a judge could wave away. Friday morning arrived pale and cold. Denise dressed me herself that morning, in a clean flannel shirt and old slacks, murmuring that Meadowbrook was expecting me by noon, that a transport service would be by to collect me gently. I did not resist when the van pulled up. Plain white, no markings, exactly the kind of vehicle designed to look institutional and forgettable. Tyler carried a single duffel bag of my clothes to the curb. He hugged me stiffly on the driveway, patted my back, and murmured that he loved me and would visit every Sunday, a promise so hollow it nearly made me laugh out loud. I leaned in close to his ear as he pulled away and I said, quietly, I hope it was worth it. He froze completely, his eyes searching my face for the confused old man he thought he'd conquered, and I gave him nothing back but empty, glassy eyes. The van pulled 2 blocks before turning off the county road onto a gravel lot behind a shuttered hardware store, exactly as planned. The side door slid open, and instead of an orderly, Priscilla Vance stood waiting in a charcoal suit, sharp-eyed and unbothered by the cold. She told me my performance had been flawless, that Denise and Tyler had bought every second of it. The driver, it turned out, worked private security for Priscilla's firm, not for any nursing facility at all. I climbed into her black sedan, and we drove into the city, into an underground garage beneath a boutique hotel where a suite had already been leased under a shell company. Ray had quietly set up years earlier at Rosalind's instruction. From that suite, I watched everything unfold on a laptop screen. Denise and Tyler, believing me safely locked away, threw open the lake house to Frank Delgado that very afternoon. I watched Denise walk him through room by room, gesturing at the fireplace, the dock, the water views, presenting my dead son's home like a showroom floor. I watched her slide the forged, backdated power of attorney across the table with a saleswoman's smile. I watched Frank Delgado's people begin drafting closing documents right there at my own kitchen table. That night, Priscilla's team executed the second half of Rosalind's plan. Using the shell company's resources, they'd spent the previous 2 days quietly acquiring the defaulted business loans tied to Tyler's struggling craft brewery, a business I'd learned he'd financed almost entirely through predatory short-term lenders, hiding the truth of its failure behind a confident social media presence. The moment those loans transferred, Priscilla's firm became Tyler's primary creditor with full legal standing to call in the debt at the first missed covenant, and Tyler, drowning already, had missed several. I watched through the hidden camera as Tyler's phone lit up that evening with a flood of frozen account notifications. I watched him drop to his knees in what used to be my living room, his face draining of color, as every account tied to his brewery locked down simultaneously. Denise, oblivious upstairs, was already toasting her closing champagne with Frank Delgado's assistant, congratulating herself on a fast, clean, $610,000 sale. Saturday morning, I put on the tailored charcoal suit Priscilla had waiting for me, my silver hair combed back, my hands finally steady because I had nothing left to hide. Ray met me in the parking garage, and together we drove the restored 1,958 Chris Craft on its trailer right up the driveway of the lake house, the polished mahogany catching the morning sun like something out of another life entirely. I stepped out onto my own gravel driveway, not as a shuffling, broken old man, but as the owner of everything they thought they'd already taken from me. I walked through my own front door, and the room went silent. Denise's champagne flute nearly slipped from her fingers. "You're supposed to be at Meadowbrook," she stammered. Tyler stared at me from the floor, where he still knelt among his own scattered financial ruin, his mouth open, no words coming out. I told them Meadowbrook's amenities left something to be desired, and that I'd found better accommodations for the weekend. Priscilla stepped in behind me and dropped a thick folder onto the kitchen table, right on top of the closing documents Frank Delgado's assistant had been organizing. She explained, calmly and clearly, that the power of attorney Denise had used was fraudulent and backdated, that federal wire fraud charges were already being prepared, and that the sale currently being finalized on this table constituted an additional felony in progress. Frank Delgado's assistant went pale, gathered her papers without a word, and left without so much as a goodbye, taking Denise's cash buyer and her entire escape plan with her. I played the recording next, the one Ray's hidden camera had captured, Denise's voice clear and unmistakable, discussing the forged documents with Tyler 2 nights earlier. Denise's face went the color of old paper. Tyler finally spoke, his voice cracking, calling me Grandpa, begging me to understand that the brewery had needed the money, that he never meant for it to go this far. I looked down at my grandson, kneeling amid the wreckage of a life built on other people's inheritance, and I told him that I had breathed insurance office, fluorescent lighting for 30 years, and driven a delivery route with a busted heater so that his father would never know hunger, and his father had raised him better than this, whatever choices he'd made in the last 2 weeks. I gave them 15 minutes to pack whatever fit in 2 bags and leave the property. Denise screamed that she needed more time for her belongings, and Priscilla informed her flatly that everything inside the house was currently frozen as collateral against Tyler's defaulted debt. They scrambled and wept and packed in a frantic silence, broken only by Denise's occasional shrieking accusation that this was somehow Tyler's fault alone, that she'd only ever wanted to help. The marriage, already brittle, cracked open completely in front of me on that kitchen floor. In the weeks that followed, the federal wire fraud investigation moved fast once Priscilla's firm submitted everything. Denise filed for divorce within 10 days, trying to distance herself, but the recordings and the forged paperwork tied her hands directly to the fraud. Tyler lost the brewery entirely, lost the condo he and Denise had leased, and last I heard was working the loading dock at a distribution warehouse 2 counties over, starting from nothing the way I once had, except without 30 years of a father's love cushioning the fall. I never moved back into that lake house full-time. Too many ghosts, too much borrowed grief pressed into every room. Instead, working with Priscilla, I turned it into a retreat for grieving fathers and grandfathers, men who'd lost adult children and found themselves suddenly invisible to the family that remained, a place with a dock and 6 restored wooden boats, and nothing but quiet water for as far as you could see. These days, you'll find me in that old boathouse most mornings, sanding down the hull of an old Chris craft alongside Ray, both of us covered in sawdust and varnish, laughing about nothing in particular the way men do when the worst has already happened and there's nothing left to fear. I keep a photograph of Rosalind on the workbench, taken decades ago in front of that very boathouse, and some mornings I just stand there and look at it and marvel at the woman I thought I knew completely. If there's one thing losing my son and nearly losing everything else taught me, it's this: love your children with your whole heart, but never let them mistake your devotion for weakness. Protecting someone from every hard truth doesn't make them strong. It makes them entitled. Real strength is standing your ground, even when it's your own blood standing across from you. You are never too old and never too tired to demand the dignity you spent a lifetime earning. If you believe respect has to be earned and not simply handed down with a last name, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this one, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight.